In at number 10, we have the Casteroides, and most people probably wouldn't consider this a great underwater tame, but when you think of it, it kind of does make sense considering that this is a beaver, and it actually is pretty good underwater. Although if you're not really a fan of this creature, just pretend I'm talking about the carb enemies here, as that is another great creature at this early stage of the game, albeit the carb enemies you can unlock at an earlier stage in terms of its saddle level compared to the Casteroides, but the Casteroides has a smithy as its saddle, so if you're going into deep depths of the ocean you can repair some stuff, which is nice. I wouldn't really usually take them that far, but I have before, and it works as long as you have a good enough melee weapon on yourself to actually deal that damage, because they don't really deal a very high amount of damage compared to some of the other creatures on this list, but they definitely are a great shout in, again, those early to mid game stages of the game when there really just isn't anything better or more accessible, because getting to the ocean can be a pretty scary thing and daunting, especially for new players, although it could also be a very exciting thing. You just get in there and you tame something like a Megalodon instantly, but you know, it just kind of depends what type of player you are, really. Next up, we have the Beelzebufo, and another creature which you would kind of expect to be great in the water, but some people may not see instantly as just, oh yeah, this is a great underwater tame. And actually, the main use for this creature isn't its swimming, but I personally think that it does really excel in this category, considering it is a very fast and agile swimmer. Again, damage is something which it just can't do. It just can't really do any kind of damage. If underwater insects were a thing though, it would be amazing. Not like it can't do any damage though. It definitely can inflict something, and it can work efficiently in those scenarios, but it's mainly just for getting from A to B, and they're just so quick and agile in the water, you really can't take them out of this list, as sometimes you want a creature which can deal loads of damage, but they tend to be a lot slower than the creatures which are just really speedy and can't do a lot of damage, and it depends what you need for any scenario. If I'm just traveling around the ocean, I may take one of these things as they're small, very easily portable. I know cryos exist, so pretty much every creature is portable, but this one especially because it can fit through any kind of dino gate, and it's really small and it's really quick and surprisingly efficient underwater. Next up, we've got the Spino, and this definitely is a very underrated creature in my opinion for underwater travel, as you probably wouldn't think of using one, but if you ever do use one of these things for underwater travel, you realise how good they are. They're fast, they're agile, they have that hydration buff, which really does play a huge part in these creatures being great underwater, as that is a buff which makes their damage just so much more effective. Like on land, yeah, they deal loads of damage and they're a great carnivore even for bosses, but you take that into the water and it's buffed even more. It's just an insane ability to have. Not sure if they have oxygen, because I think they didn't used to and now they do, but I'm pretty sure the drain is just so slow, it's not going to affect you either way, and you're going to be totally fine with that drain, no issues whatsoever. Either way, every time I've used a Spino underwater, you can see it kind of being used here, that oxygen has not been an issue. And if you did want to do the underwater caves with these things on a map like the island, it could be a great shout, as it can easily kill things like Moses and Plesios and those kind of creatures, and also Dunkleostises as well, which can be a little bit of a pain because they're quite armored, but it will shred through them easily and quickly, and it's really an efficient creature in underwater scenarios, but the only real downside is its size. It's quite a big creature to be taking underwater, which, you know, could play to your benefit because you're trying to deal loads of damage, but sometimes it's not really quite what you want, and you might want a bit of a smaller carnivore like the next creature which is on this list, but it still has huge amounts of value underwater. And if you've never used one before in the ocean of any Ark map, I would definitely advise that you tame yourself a Spino and get into the ocean depths. In at number 7, we've got the Baryonyx. But why is this better than the Spinos? You might think Spino bigger, just better version of the Baryonyx, really. Well, the main thing is due to its size and agility and mobility. I vastly prefer it over the Spinos underwater. Again, Spino, a great underwater creature, but this would be more my go-to, and especially with the underwater caves on a map like the island. And ASA is a great example here because it only really has the island. I know Svartalfheim is there as well, but most people are just playing the island, the Baryonyx is a great shout, and it's so convenient for getting down there, and especially considering it has a special ability as well, which underwater doesn't work on land, but if you right click on your mouse it will do a spin attack, and it can stun creatures up to the size of a megalodon, making it a very great creature for combat underwater as well, because it deals a significant amount of damage and actually has a pretty high health stat. And again, with that mobility, they're very useful underwater, and the fact that you can stun a creature like the megalodon, nothing bigger obviously, Moses and Plesios, that's not going to happen, but like it's just such a cool and nice little ability to have, which really gives you a kind of blanket of protection underwater, as you can quickly get away from any threats that are megalodon sized or smaller if need be. Next up, we've got the Ichthyosaurus, and it did really have to be on this list at some point, didn't it? When you think of this as pretty much one of the best creatures for getting around the ocean biome in Ark, it's just one of those creatures which is fantastic, amazing, and I don't know, this creature, there's just so much about it which makes it very appealing, especially for your first like proper underwater tame, Castoroides, Carbenemes aside, as they're passive tame and they often don't spawn in the ocean depths. I'm pretty sure they don't even spawn, but they spawn, well they do spawn, but they don't spawn in the depths of the ocean. They spawn on coastlines, and if you just get a little bit of, I think even normal meat works, and go up to it and just passive feed them, just gradually, especially because you've got taming tracker now, you can just chuck that on after you put the first beat of meat into them, and then you can just track them, and then whenever you're ready to put that second piece of meat in, then go for it, put that next piece of meat in, and just keep doing that, and then you've got yourself one of these things. Just park it in one of Ark's many bays which you'll find, and then craft yourself a saddle and get out there into the ocean, and it really is a huge gateway into the water. And you can always take it out to the surface here like I'm doing, because I didn't even know this thing was pink, but now I do. Lovely pink coloured Ichthyosaurus. In at number 5, we've got the Moser, and this creature definitely did have to be on this list, and especially with X-Mosers, it's just an even better creature now. It's just, man, the Moser is one of the most hard-hitting ocean creatures, and it does have a platform saddle as well, although I don't really find that to be the most useful out there, because, you know, I don't really need an underwater base. I can always just build in any underwater caves if I need one, and I don't need a mobile base on the back of a mosasaur. So I never really used that platform saddle, and also I always find my platform saddles on creatures like Mosers and Titanosaurs and Brontos, and sometimes even Quetzals when you build a base on the back of them, that you just really can't see anything, and I like to be able to see a lot around me. But X-Mosers on Gen 1, you can really get so much use out of the Mosasaurus, and they just deal so much damage, and great for the Moda boss fight on that map too, but just great for killing anything underwater if that's your thing. Next up, we have got the Megalodon, and I think that this creature definitely does have to be put on the list here for great ocean creatures, as it is a ridiculously easy tame to tame on underwater, on any map, on underwater, in an underwater scenario, on any map. These things are so easy, especially X-Megalodons. I know they're slightly harder to tame, and it's on the Gen 1 ocean, so there's a lot more eels around, but still, if you have Gen 1, go for an X-Megalodon on that map. You will not be unhappy with that tame, because they're so easy, even on any map, just no matter the map. Yes, X1's a little bit harder, they're just so easy to tame. Again, quite a good introduction after you tame yourself an Ichthyosaurus. Get yourself a harpoon launcher, get yourself some trank harpoon thingy majigs, or you can even just use a crossbow and trank arrows if you want as well. Harpoon launcher is the kind of more, you know, utilized one in my opinion. It makes it slightly easier, although crossbows work fine. And you have your creature which can deal a huge amount of bleed damage, which is really great, and it deals so much damage for how easy it is to tame compared to a creature like the Moser. In at number 3, we have the Shadowmane, and this creature is just so great in the water, and again, you might not expect it to be, but considering its damage and that hydration buff shared with the Spino, it's just an even more buff underwater creature. And what makes it better than the Spino is it is smaller and more agile, which really does benefit it in any underwater scenarios. You can get out anywhere really quickly, and again, really portable, and you might just be using this mount to generally travel around the map, whereas with a Spino, you might only be using that for underwater stuff, and then when you take it onto the surface, you have a different creature. Like a Thyla is quite a common one. If you take the Thyla underwater, well, you can, but if it was really good underwater, then that would be a huge benefit. But the Shadowmane is kind of replacing it there. Or the Thyla was never good in water, but you can see how good the Shadowmane is in water, and considering it is a lionfish lion and you tame it with fish, it does make sense that it'd be great underwater. But it really is a terrific underwater tame, and if you haven't already, definitely go out and tame yourself with Shadowmane and test it underwater. You will not be displeased with the results, apart from the actual taming method being a pain. In at number 2 we have the Basilosaurus, and the reason why this is on the list is pretty self-explanatory. It's quite easy water tame, again being a passive tame. The only difficulty is getting rid of all of the mantas which are around it, but then afterwards you have a creature which is immune to eel and jellyfish, which is an insane feat to have, and no other creatures have it at the moment. The Phascosuchus will, but that's not being added until March. Sadly it does have a depth limit, but that's not really the worst thing, and if you're on the island you won't really encounter that when going into any of the caves, which is what it's really great for. Obviously you will encounter that if you go right down to the depths, and on one of the entrances you will, but overall it's not really that bad and not really too much of an issue, and the fact that it's immune to electric, eel, stings and jellyfish and all of that is really a godsend. And it also makes oil, which is really nice, and it also makes a cute rainbow. But before we get into number 1, I've just got a couple of honourable mentions. The Mega Chelon is a great one. The only reason why I didn't put it on this list is the tame method. Again, the Plesiosaur will be a great one. The Dunkleosteus, although not used too widely, is another pretty cool one as well, and that pretty sums it up. Let's get into number 1. In at number 1 we have the Bloodstalker, and ever since this thing came out on Gen 1, I have never used a different creature after I've tamed one of these things to use underwater. I will go on to Gen 1 or Gen 2 where you'll find Bloodstalkers, and then I'll tame them and transfer them across all of the maps which I'll be playing on Extinction at the moment. I know it doesn't have any water. I still have a Bloodstalker over though, because I like them as well just for general travel, although still a little bit rusty, but less rusty than I was in this B-roll, because this was about maybe a month or 2 ago, this B-roll in terms of age. I've improved a little bit since then, so I can actually kind of get around. But either way, they're just so agile and easy to control under the water, and they can glide across the top as well. So if you want to kind of evade danger, you kind of can by just skimming over the top of it, and it really isn't that bad. And then as long as you're not just in the middle of the ocean with nothing else to grab onto, you can always just swing onto something if it becomes a little bit too dangerous and just get out of that situation. If you're in the middle of the ocean, at least these things do have a great damage stat and can pull some smaller creatures in as well to suck the life force out of them, and then that's actually kind of creepy, and they also do that to you if they get low enough health. Either way, really agile, really quick ocean mounts, and if you've ever used one in the ocean before, you just know how effective they are, and they're pretty much faster than everything else, which definitely plays to their benefit, as you can kind of get out of any danger whatsoever. Nothing which can come near you will do any significant damage to you, because you can just quickly zip away like that. If you haven't already, I really urge you to try this creature underwater, and afterwards I'm sure you'll never go back. In at number 10 we have the Rock Drake, and in my opinion this creature had to make the list, as it is an absolute cheese on Arboration for defeating Rockwell. And although maybe that's not the biggest percentage of all Ark maps, only being one of the main maps, which I think there are like 6 or 7, but still I think considering how easy that boss is made because of this creature, it deserves to be on the list. And also it just is a great creature apart from that, but there's not really many other uses on other maps for this creature. You can't really use it for other bosses, and also just transferring from Arboration can be a huge pain anyway, so you always want to be quite careful with that. But considering these creatures being just so great for doing any cheesing of the Rockwell boss on Arboration, I think they just had to make the list. Although yes, more of a rare case, still to me it really does just it deserves to be here. Next up we have the Megatherium, and this creature again has a more specific case, although you can use it for a lot of bosses out there, although its main use is for any boss that has the Broodmother or just the Broodmother included, as sometimes some maps just like to mash together a couple of bosses and then just make that the final boss of the Ark map. And you can kind of say the Overseer sort of does that as well, but you know, that's a little bit of an unworthy case, I would say, because you know, there's loads of other bosses you're facing as well at the same time, and you've got the Overseer, really not very useful for that fight, although they can get through the tech cave with relative ease compared to something like a Rex. But the reason why these things are actually just so good at defeating things like the Broodmother is because of a ability which they have, which allows them to deal insane damage to insects, and they can get that by killing an insect. And maybe you might think, well, you just have to kill the Broodmother and then you get the buff. Well, the Broodmother spawns loads of Urania minions, so it's really easy and quick to get that buff. And then if you have a UT buffing it on top of it as well, it really does play a huge part in any kind of given boss scenario. And actually, talking about the UT, I didn't put it on this list, and I didn't put the Daedon on it either, but I'm going to give them a quick mention here, as they are pretty much largely essential boss creatures, although maybe not strictly necessary for dealing that damage. They really do increase your chances of winning a fight, and I kind of feel bad for not mentioning them. Next up, we have the Megalosaurus, and this really is a great boss creature, especially for maps like Arboration. Again, although it is useful on some other maps too, so it had to be included on this list, in my opinion. Like, you look at this creature, it really does pack a punch in the damage department, and they're quite small, so if you want to get through the tech cave, you're not going to have too much of an issue, especially on ASA, because of the Dino implemented features where they can actually go round objects and be somewhat smart compared to just normal Arks, where they'll just take the shortest path, or at least try to, and then probably just end up falling into some lava, and then you won't end up having a particularly good time, and really not going to sit nicely for an experience for you. And you can actually see one of the abilities here. This thing is gripping a Minecraft from its mouth, and it just tears it to shreds, and then once it's dead, you can just keep going with your life, I guess, as an Ark creature. But it's kind of nice because Minecrafters are absolute pests, although you don't really find them in any boss environment. Quite useful for some Dimorphodons on the Dragon boss fight, those. They can quickly snatch those up and kill them, as they are an absolute nuisance as they damage the rider, and they can really decrease the chances of you actually winning that boss fight. So that is an extremely great use of these creatures. If you don't have Theres, I would recommend using the Megalosaurus, or the Megalosaurus and some Theres, so you can get those Dimorphodons, very different creatures, taken out while still being able to not have all your creatures die because of the incredibly OP fire buff, which really does hurt any kind of carnivorous creature. Speaking of the Theri, in number 7, we do have the Theri, and I kind of talked about the rationale behind this creature being here, and it is really great for the dragon boss fight, or any boss fight that has the dragon in it, of course, as it's going to have that fire ability, which is not going to be particularly friendly to any carnivorous creature, but also this thing's saddle does unlock at level 69. Now, apart from that absolutely amazing thing coming from the saddle level of this creature, it's also a great gatherer, although that doesn't really make it a particularly great boss creature, but it does gather fiber quite well. So apart from being a really good boss creature, this thing is really good at just general resource gathering, which is another reason to tame it if you're not thinking of doing bosses currently. It doesn't really matter what map you're on. If the Theri spawns there, they are going to be extremely useful, as they do spawn on every map, I'm pretty sure. Like, they're kind of just that common creature that you really you don't not have on any given map. And although yes, on official, their taming does take a little bit of a while considering their size, but it's mainly just because of the food you give them. It's a lot easier to get prime meat than some like vegetables, which you obviously have to grow and you have to do that high process. You can use kibble, of course, but still, generally this is going to take a lot longer than a carnivorous tame, but it still is well worth it, especially if you're thinking of doing the dragon boss fight, or if you just really need a lot of fiber in your life. Next up, we have the Giga, and this thing has to be included here for its insanely great use on Extinction. Although nowadays there is one creature which has sort of replaced it, which is later on in the list, and you'll hear about that creature maybe in just a couple of minutes. And either way, this creature, if you can tell already, deals a huge amount of damage, and it really does have the health to pack a punch as well. It makes it a really useful creature for that. Its only real downsides is its rage meter and its terrible stamina. Although you probably won't be riding this creature when using it, considering that they're mainly used for the Titan boss fights, and you're going to have loads of these things anyway, and you might be riding something like a mech or maybe just another equivalent creature, although you can end up on Gigas at some point. You might want to use the UT to buff it up, although you really don't want to get near that damage zone, as that UT is going to die very quickly. And if you're doing the Desert Titan on Extinction, you're going to want to use a Quetzal instead. You really can't use Gigas for this thing. The Quetzal is the best creature for it, so I'm going to give it a slight mention here as well, although it's pretty much only useful for that boss fight. And you can kind of say the Moser is really great for the Moda boss fight, the same as the Megalodon, although they're in extremely rare cases, and they're not even the main bosses of the map, apart from obviously that previous example, but the Moda isn't the main boss of Genesis Part 1. In at number 5, we have got the Spino, and I know I've already talked about it earlier, but I kind of want, if I was to put the UT on this list, I would put it in at this spot, as I think all the creatures past it the better, but it's kind of on par where the Spino is. It's just, you're quite limited when you've only got 10 creatures on the list, and maybe I should have spent a little bit more time thinking and considering. And for the Daedon, for that example, I would have probably put that in at like number 9, number 8. That's kind of where it sits, as is less essential. You kind of maybe put the Snow out there as well, but that is in even rarer cases, so I don't really think it deserves to make the list. But the reason why the Spino is here is because of this thing's great mobility, and it also deals quite a huge amount of damage as well, which again does play huge benefit for this creature. You can get a creature which deals insane amounts of damage and also has quite high mobility. Compared to something like the Rex though, it does lack in the health department, but it's just so mobile. It really is a creature worth considering. And actually, if I'm doing the Megapithecus at boss fight, I might actually use Spinos for it. I'll use Megatherians for the Broodmother, then obviously Theres for the Dragon, and then I'll use these things for the Megapithecus, although I have used Rexes for all 3 bosses on the island. Mainly the Megapithecus, of course. I pretty much only go for Theres if I'm sticking to just creatures on the island. Otherwise, all of these bosses can be pretty easily done with the Deinonychus, but that is much later on the list. Either way, these things have the hydration buff as well, so they're actually pretty useful for the Moda if you want to do that. On top of that, they can turn 360 on the spot, again playing to their mobility, and they can stand up on their hind legs, dealing even more damage. Sadly, they don't have the bleed ability, but still a very great boss creature. Next up, we have the Carcharodontosaurus. Sorry about that blurry picture there, I really do need to find a new one, but my previous one got deleted and I've looked, but I can't really find one. Maybe AI can do something in the future, or I'll just find that previous image wherever that thing's gone. But either way, this is essentially just the Giga upgrade. This creature is a Giga, but it doesn't have the rage buff. It deals more damage, and obviously because of that rage buff, it actually means this creature has more health, as it doesn't go into rage, and it will stay fighting right till 0 HP, which is really a huge benefit, and it makes this creature significantly more reliable to tame and to use than the Giga. Actually, maybe not to tame, because these things are really not the most reliable to tame because of their taming methods. A lot more things can go wrong. It's not just a simple knockout tame. You've got to drag creatures to it, and then after that you've got to let it eat those creatures, and it can't kill any other creatures for a significant amount of time, obviously until that blood rage fades away, because it can't be in a blood rage while you're taming it. But then after you've got it past that stage, it really isn't too hard to go around and kill loads of creatures and then actually tame it, although it's kind of sad that you get knocked off when you tame it, because you don't need a saddle to tame this thing, but then as soon as it is tamed, you do need a saddle to ride it. Just a little nitpick from me, but again, this is going to be a really useful creature for the bosses on Extinction, and that's pretty much it. But it really does play a huge part, and it is a very huge damage dealer, and I had to put it on the list. In at number 3, we have the Rex, and this kind of had to be here, okay? It's such a well-balanced carnivore, in my opinion. It just had to make the list. When you look at this thing, it deals a very hefty amount of damage. It has a very good health stat. Although its mobility isn't the greatest, you don't need that all too much in general combat scenarios, and it really does pack a punch, and it's ridiculously easy to tame, especially on ASA, as you can literally take this thing as a baby by just killing its parents and then just simply pressing a button, and unless you're on official, it will raise pretty quickly, as you can just have a Rex like that. And drops are very commonly found with Rex saddles on ASA, because drops are so much more OP on ASA than just general normal Arc, kind of as they should be, and you see that in the later DLC maps of Arc when you go into like Gen 2 and all of that. Drops can't seem to fix themselves. Don't know why they haven't really done that for the island, but maybe they're just like, it doesn't need, the island is just, it's what it is now. It's just that first map that, although it's been really well designed, it does lack in a few features that the other maps really deliver, and sometimes, you know, there are some features in the new maps you kind of take for granted, although you don't really notice that too much in your Ark playing. It's just a couple of nitpicks when you go to like Gen 2 and all those newer maps. There's just a few things which just, they work better, not it work better. What is wrong with my grammar today? But yeah, sadly also the Rex doesn't deal the bleed ability, but it can do the roar and knock people off their riders. Again, not really too useful for bosses, but once paired with a UT and get this thing buffed even more, its health will last in any decently long boss fight, especially on Gen 1 actually. It's extremely useful for the Master Controller, and you know, they deal a quite hefty amount of damage and are really useful for just any kind of general boss fight that isn't one on extinction. In at number 2, we have got the Shadowmane, and in my opinion, this had to be here. And although its tame method is kind of a little bit annoying and a lot of things can go wrong along the way, once you've tamed a very high level male and female, you can simply breed these things and get that breeding chain going and getting yourself some really nice Shadowmanes, and then you don't have to do too much Shadowmane taming. That's why I don't really recommend going for a low level first time. Just go for the highest level you can find, get a male and a female and just get them breeding right away, because frankly it isn't really worth it. You can get better stats with breeding creatures and they are particularly quite a pain to tame. But the thing about these Shadowmane, they have very decent damage, very decent health, and very decent mobility. And also, they come at quite a decent size as well. And if you transfer onto the island, the tech cave becomes an absolute breeze when using a creature like this. But also just any general boss fight, they're pretty good for the Master Controller, although I've never used them for that. Really, I've seen some other people use it for them though, and they've been really successful with it. The reason why I haven't is they weren't actually out at the time I did the Master Controller, but I have used them for Rockwell on Gen 2 and all of the island bosses, and also all the bosses on Ragnarok, and they work really well. The only real hurdle is getting over that taming method. And finally, in at number 1, we have got the Deinonychus, and in my opinion, I just have to put this thing here. The fact that this can deal bleed damage to bosses is an absolute game changer, and any of the bosses where you use Rexes or Megatheriums and Theries, these creatures are going to be extremely useful for all of those. With the bleed ability, those bosses can be very quickly done, and you don't really have to worry about the dragon's breathing attack, as that boss is going to go through so quickly, and even when it's in the air, that health is still going to be draining down. So it really does play a huge part in the Ark boss experience, and compared to the Shadowmane, they are significantly easier to tame. Like, you compare the tame method for the Shadowmane to this thing, they are so much easier to tame, and although they aren't quite as mobile because they can't jump like 10 million feet into the air, they still do have quite a lot of mobility. They don't take full damage. They have the pack buff. Sadly, they lose on the hydration buff, but you know, you're probably not going to be using these things for the Moda, and general boss arenas don't tend to have water in it, so not too useful for boss scenarios, although it can be useful in some cases. Either way, these creatures, in my opinion, are just so good at defeating bosses. Again, I need to say it, that bleed ability really does become an absolute game changer, and just for general use as well, they're really great creatures for just killing anything and traveling the map. So they're really great multi-use creature as well, but they're mainly used for me in bosses, and I really don't know where I'd be in Ark if I didn't have the Deinonychus here. Actually, probably with the Shadowmane, but in my opinion, this is a far superior creature. But anyway, that is the end of today's video, and I really hope that you all enjoyed this one, as I really enjoyed making it. As always, comment down below what is the best Ark boss creature. Sorry about missing the Yeti and the Daedon. And also, if you don't agree with this list, comment down your top 10, and I'll see you all later.